By the time the wedding hymn reached its second verse, Miriam Hail had begun to feel as though the people of Red Mesa were attending her funeral instead. She sat at the far end of the last pew, where the varnish had worn away and a splinter pressed through the wool of her skirt. The church was too small for the number of bodies inside it. Heat gathered beneath the rafters, carrying the mixed smells of candle wax, dust, damp collars, and the sweet white flowers arranged around the altar. Someone had ordered lilies from Tucson, and their perfume had become so thick that Miriam could taste it whenever she breathed. Beside her, Agnes Bell whispered about a burial plot that had opened near the cottonwood fence. "You would be close to Daniel," Agnes said, as though this were a kindness. "It comforts a person to have matters settled." Miriam kept her eyes on the bride and groom. The bride was 19, pink-cheeked and unafraid, with ribbons at her wrists and a veil trembling each time the hot air moved through the open windows. On the opposite aisle, Lila Vane leaned toward a friend and laughed behind her glove. She was the merchant's daughter, young enough to consider every room a stage and every older woman part of the furniture. Miriam had once stood near that same altar in a cream dress sewn by her mother. She had been 20 then, hopeful and frightened, holding Daniel Hale's hand, while the minister promised that obedience and industry would make a good life. 20 years later, Daniel lay beneath red earth on the northern edge of the ranch, and Miriam had discovered that industry could keep cattle alive, mend a roof, and pull a wagon from sand. But it could not persuade a town to see a widow as anything except a life already completed. Agnes was still speaking. "There is no shame in arranging things early. At your age, surprises are rarely pleasant." Miriam turned her head. "At my age?" Agnes blinked, startled that the furniture had answered. "You know what I mean." Miriam did. 41, 2 years widowed. No children, no brother willing to take over the ranch, no intention of selling. In Red Mesa, these facts added up to a kind of social death. The women brought bread she had not asked for. The men offered low prices for her land and called the offers practical. The minister spoke to her about acceptance. Even kindness arrived with a shovel in its hand. When the vows ended, the congregation rose in a rush of skirts and boots. Miriam waited until the aisle cleared, then slipped through the side door before the cake was cut. Outside, the Arizona afternoon struck her full in the face. The heat had bleached the street almost white. Horses stood with lowered heads at the hitching rail, tails switching at flies. Somewhere behind the church, a fiddle began a bright, foolish tune. Lila Vane called after her. "Mrs. Hale, you are not staying?" Miriam lifted one hand without turning. The wagon wheels rattled hard over the dry road. Each mile away from town loosened something in her chest. The buildings fell behind. Mesquite and creosote took their place. The land opened into long ochre flats broken by shelves of black rock and distant mountains the color of smoke. At the Hale Ranch, no one asked whether she was lonely. The north fence needed 3 new posts. A heifer had torn her flank on wire. The windmill coughed whenever the western gusts shifted. Work did not pity her, which was one reason she trusted it. She changed into a faded work dress, tied on an apron made from flour sacking, and went straight to the well yard. Beside the stone-lined shaft stood the iron lifting rig Daniel had bought shortly before his death. It had been designed to raise water barrels, engine parts, and stubborn loads from the wash below the ridge. The gears were rusted at the edges, but Miriam had cleaned and greased them until she knew every tooth and pin. She set a bucket on the hook and turned the crank. The handle resisted, then moved. Metal rasped against metal. The sound carried across the empty yard. Daniel had never liked the rig. He had cursed its weight and spoken of replacing it with a newer model. Miriam had learned its moods instead. She knew when to add oil, when to stop before the cable twisted, and how to brace one boot against the timber frame so that her whole body worked with the mechanism rather than against it. By sunset, she had watered the horses, checked the heifer, patched a gap in the chicken run, and hauled 2 sacks of meal into the pantry. Her shoulders ached pleasantly. On the porch, she drank from a tin cup while the western sky deepened from gold to copper. Clouds had gathered over the mountains. They were not the high, harmless clouds that dissolved before reaching the valley. These were dark along the bottom and piled high, moving with purpose. The air cooled suddenly. A scent rose from the flats, wet stone, bruised creosote, and something metallic. Miriam stood. Rain in the desert was never merely rain. It could be a blessing, but only for those who respected how quickly a dry channel could become a weapon. She crossed the yard to bring the mare into the barn. Before she reached the gate, thunder struck somewhere beyond the northern ridge. The ground seemed to answer. A low vibration traveled up through the soles of her boots. Then came a sound she knew too well: water. Not the trickle of a ditch or the drumming of drops on a roof. This was the deep, growing roar of a flash flood moving through the upper canyons. Miriam grabbed a coil of rope from the barn wall and ran toward the big wash. Rain began in hard, widely spaced drops that darkened the dust. Wind tore at her skirt. By the time she reached the ridge, the sky had closed and the world below had become a moving brown wall. The wash, dry that morning, now carried whole branches, fence rails, stones, and clumps of uprooted brush. The first surge slammed into the bend and rolled over itself in red foam. Miriam shielded her eyes. A horse screamed. She saw it 50 yards downstream. A chestnut mare wedged against a pile of roots near the outer bank. The animal's forelegs struck wildly at the current, but the hindquarters were trapped. Something darker moved beside it. A man. Miriam ran along the ridge until she reached the narrowest descent. Mud slid beneath her boots as she went down. The current struck cold around her calves. The man was pinned beneath the mare's side. One leg had twisted beneath the saddle, and the horse's weight held his hip against a limestone shelf. He wore a buckskin shirt dark with water. Blood ran from his hairline, disappearing into the mud on his cheek. His face was young, but there was nothing boyish in the way he watched the flood. Apache, Miriam thought. A scout, perhaps. His rifle was gone. A leather pouch clung to his belt. One hand gripped a root while the other worked uselessly at the trapped stirrup. He looked at her, then passed her toward the upper bend. Another surge was coming. She could hear it in the pitch of the roar. "Can you feel your foot?" she shouted. He stared at her mouth, perhaps trying to catch the words through the noise. She pointed to his leg. He answered with a sharp nod, then shook his head halfway through the motion. Pain tightened his face. Miriam crouched beside the horse. The mare snapped at the water, wild-eyed. The saddle horn was still intact. Miriam passed the rope under the breast strap, then around the horn, making 2 loops so the pull would distribute through the leather, instead of tearing one piece free. The man caught her wrist. His grip was weak but urgent. "No horse," he said. His voice was rough. "Second water." "I know." He looked toward the ridge again, clearly expecting her to leave. Instead, Miriam shoved the end of the rope into his hand. "Hold this away from your throat." She climbed the bank on hands and knees. Mud packed beneath her fingernails. At the top, she ran for the wagon she had left near the fence line and backed it toward the wash until the rear wheels sank. The iron lifting rig was bolted into the wagon bed for moving stone. She threaded the rope through the upper wheel, locked the secondary brake, and hauled until the slack disappeared. Below, the chestnut mare thrashed. The rope tightened so suddenly it sang. Miriam leaned into the crank. Nothing moved. She repositioned her feet and tried again. The gear advanced 1 tooth with a violent click. The handle kicked against her palm. She caught it before it spun backward. Rain ran into her eyes. Her wet sleeves clung to her arms. Another tooth. The rope cut through the muddy edge of the bank. The wagon groaned. Miriam stopped thinking in sentences. There was only the crank, the brake, the pull, and the terrible resistance below. She put her shoulder under the handle and drove upward. The gear turned. The mare's body shifted an inch. The trapped man shouted, not from fear but as a warning. The second surge appeared around the bend. It was higher than the first, full of timber and black debris. Miriam released the brake half a notch, changed the angle of the line, and cranked again. The horse's hindquarters rose enough for the current to get underneath. For one breath, the animal seemed certain to roll onto the man. Then the rope held, the saddle twisted, and the mare lunged forward. Mud released her with a sucking crack. The man's leg came free. Miriam locked the gear and ran back down. The mare scrambled toward shallower ground, dragging the rope behind her. The man lay half submerged, his injured leg bent at an angle no leg should take. The new wall of water was less than 100 yards away. Miriam hooked her arms beneath his shoulders. "Help me with the good leg." He tried. His boot found stone, slipped, found it again. Together they moved 1 yard, then another. The current rose to Miriam's thighs. A branch struck her hip and spun away. The man's weight pulled at her spine. He was lean, but wet leather and exhausted muscle made him heavy. He sagged. "Stay awake." His eyes opened. "What is your name?" she shouted. He said something she did not hear. Again, "Tomas, Miriam." "Now move." He gave a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. They reached the slope. Miriam turned, pressed her back against his chest, and dragged him upward while he pushed with his uninjured heel. The bank dissolved beneath them. Once they slid almost to the waterline, the roar filled the world. Miriam found a desert willow root and wrapped one hand around it. With the other she caught Tomas by his collar. Her arm shook, the root bent. He reached past her and caught it too. For a moment they hung together above the flood, mud to their waists and the second surge, striking the place where they had been. The mare vanished from sight behind spray and debris. Miriam pulled until pain whitened her vision. Tomas got his good knee beneath him. They climbed the last few feet and rolled onto the high ground as the wash exploded below. A cedar trunk struck the wagon. The rear axle shifted. The iron rig screamed, then tore loose from one bolt. The ropes snapped. Miriam lay on her back in wet grass, unable to move. Rain struck her face. Beside her, Tomas breathed in shallow, uneven pulls. She turned toward him. His eyes were closed. Blood had washed clean from his temple, leaving the wound pale at the edges. His injured leg was badly swollen. The chestnut mare stood 30 yards away, trembling but alive. Miriam pushed herself upright. The town would have called the decision foolish. A lone widow bringing an injured Apache man into her home could lose what little standing she had left. Sheriff Silas Thorne might decide the scout was wanted. Arthur Vane might use the scandal to force a sale. Agnes Bell would bring another loaf and ask whether Miriam had considered the condition of her soul. None of that mattered while Tomas lay in the rain. She fetched a blanket, splinted the leg with 2 fence slats, and built a drag from the broken wagon gate. The mare followed as Miriam hauled him toward the house. Night had fallen by the time she got him inside. The kitchen became a sick room. She stripped off his soaked outer clothing, cut away the leather around the fracture, and washed the mud from the wound with boiled water. The bone had not broken through cleanly, but the skin was torn and the lower leg had shifted. Miriam set a lamp near the bed. Tomas woke when she touched his ankle. His hand closed around the edge of the mattress. "The bone is out of line," she said. "I can leave it, and you may never use the leg properly, or I can set it now." He watched her for several seconds. "You have done this? On men once, on animals often. That is not the same. No." A faint challenge moved through his eyes. "Do it." Miriam gave him a folded strip of leather to bite. She tied his thigh above the knee, braced her foot against the bed frame, and pulled steadily until the muscles lengthened. Sweat broke across his face. The tendons in his neck stood hard. "Now," he said through the leather. She shifted the lower leg. The bone moved with a dull, ugly sensation beneath her hands. Tomas arched from the bed, then collapsed. Miriam checked the alignment twice. She wrapped the limb with clean cloth, padded 2 boards with wool, and bound them from ankle to knee. For the cut at his temple, she used boiled water and honey. For the torn skin near the fracture, she mixed greasewood resin with tallow, an old remedy taught to her by a woman who had lived in the mountains before Red Mesa had more than 6 houses. The storm moved east. Water dripped from the eaves. The cabin smelled of wet leather, smoke, bitter medicine, and blood. Near midnight, fever came. Tomas began speaking in Apache, words Miriam could not follow. Sometimes his voice rose. Sometimes he seemed to answer someone standing far away. She cooled his skin with damp cloths and made him swallow willow bark tea a spoonful at a time. At dawn he grew still. Miriam sat beside him, too tired to trust the quiet. She listened for each breath. When his eyelids finally opened, his gaze moved first to the ceiling, then to the window, then to the door. Only after he had measured every possible exit did he look at her. Miriam expected suspicion. Instead, he looked down at her hands. They were red from rope burn. One knuckle had split. Mud remained beneath 2 nails despite repeated washing. He studied them longer than he studied her face. Then he lifted his eyes. "What?" she asked. His voice was barely audible. "You pulled against the water." "Yes." Alone, the rig helped. The rig did not choose. Miriam looked away first. She reached for the cup and held it while he drank. His lips were dry and cracked. When he finished, he closed his eyes, but his fingers remained lightly curled around her wrist. Not possessive, not pleading, simply certain she was there. For 3 days, Tomas drifted between sleep and fever. Miriam fed the stove through the night and kept the shutters partly closed against the white glare of afternoon. She moved the kitchen table nearer the bed so she could mend harness while watching his breathing. When he grew restless, she spoke about ordinary things. The spotted cow that had learned to open the lower gate, the roof nail that always worked loose in a north wind, the line of ants carrying grain beneath the pantry wall. She did not know whether he understood her. It was easier than praying. On the fourth morning, he woke clear-eyed and asked how long he had been there. 4 days since the flood. My horse? In the corral. She favors the left hind leg but eats well. My rifle gone. He accepted that with a small movement of his mouth. Loss, Miriam thought, was familiar territory to him. He tried to sit. Pain stopped him halfway. The leg will need 6 weeks before you put full weight on it, she said. 6 weeks is a season. It is less than the rest of your life. He studied her, then lowered himself again. Later, when she brought broth, he asked for his knife. Miriam had found it inside his belt and cleaned the mud from the sheath. You cannot hunt from that bed, she said. A man sleeps better with his own steel. She handed it to him hilt first. The gesture seemed to settle something between them. In the days that followed, Tomas spoke little, but he noticed everything. He knew when the mare had been led past the window. He recognized the difference between Miriam's boots and the lighter steps of a chicken scratching beneath the porch. He could tell by the way she set down a pan whether she was tired or angry. Miriam, in turn, learned the small signs of his pain. When his jaw tightened, the leg was throbbing. When he rubbed the center of his palm, he was thinking about leaving. When he stared at the north window for too long, he was remembering people he had not named. He never asked her to soften the truth. The wound might fester. The bone might heal short. The sheriff might hear he was there. His own people might assume he was dead. Miriam respected him for listening. By the end of the first week, he could eat at the table with his leg propped on a chair. He sharpened her kitchen knives with a flat stone from his pouch. The steady scrape of steel became part of the cabin's morning sounds. When he finished, he tested each blade against a strip of dried hide and returned it to its place. You do not owe me work, Miriam said. I owe you breath. That is too large a debt to pay with knives. Then I will pay badly for a long time. The corner of her mouth lifted before she could stop it. He saw. He said nothing, which made the smile remain. A week later, Agnes Bell arrived with a basket on her arm. Miriam saw the buckboard from the barn and reached the porch before Agnes climbed down. The older woman wore black silk despite the weekday heat. A checked cloth covered the basket, but warm bread scented the air. I worried when you missed service again, Agnes said. People have noticed. People notice weather they cannot change. Agnes's eyes moved toward the partly shuttered window. I brought sourdough. That was kind. Miriam took the basket but did not step aside. Agnes shifted her weight. May I come in? The house is untidy. I have seen untidy houses. Not mine. The answer landed cleanly. Agnes's smile tightened. There have been riders near your north line. Sheriff Thorne says everyone ought to report unusual activity. My north line is a cattle trail. Of course. Still, a woman alone can be deceived about what is safe. Miriam looked at the woman's gloved hands. Agnes had never repaired a fence, slept beside a sick calf, or listened for floodwater in darkness, yet she spoke of safety as though she sold it by the yard. I am not confused about my ranch. Agnes tried once more to look past her. Inside, a floorboard creaked. Agnes heard it. So you do have company. Miriam did not lie. I have a patient. The older woman's face changed. Curiosity brightened at first, then alarm. What kind of patient? The injured kind. Miriam, who is in your house. That is no concern of yours. It will become the town's concern if no. Miriam's voice remained quiet. The town has mistaken interest for authority. They are not the same. Agnes drew herself upright. I came as a friend. A friend would have asked whether I needed flour. You came to inspect me. For the first time since arriving, Agnes looked embarrassed. It did not last. You will regret pride when winter comes. Then I will regret it in my own house. Agnes returned to the buckboard, climbed aboard, and snapped the reins. Dust followed her down the trail. Miriam waited until the wagon disappeared before going inside. Tomas stood beside the table on one leg, one hand braced on the wall. His knife was drawn. She shut the door. You were told not to stand. She came to count doors and windows. She came to gather a story. That is another kind of counting. He slid the knife away and sat with effort. Miriam set the bread on the table. The crust was glossy with honey. Tomas broke off a piece, chewed and frowned. What? It tastes of fear. It tastes of Agnes's starter. She has kept the same one since before I married. No, the bread is good. The reason for it is bitter. Miriam laughed then. Not loudly, but enough to surprise herself. Tomas watched the change in her face as though it were rare weather. After Agnes's visit, the secret could not last. Miriam knew the town would build its version of events before sunset. In one telling, she had been bewitched. In another, she was hiding an outlaw. By the time the story reached the saloon, she would likely have sold Daniel's grave marker to finance a band of raiders. She expected Tomas to leave as soon as he could mount. Instead, he found more work. He repaired a torn saddle skirt while seated on the porch. He carved a new handle for her flour scoop. He showed her how to twist rawhide so that a gate hinge could flex without pulling loose from dry timber. When he could stand with crutches, he inspected the western fence and marked the posts that had begun rotting below the soil. "You see trouble where I see a post," Miriam said. "A post says what happened to it. This one drank too much water once, then none for years. You read wood? I read what stays still. They replaced the post together." Miriam dug while Tomas trimmed the cedar and directed the angle. The work took twice as long as it would have if she had done it alone, but the finished section was stronger. She tightened wire with the iron rig. He bound the crosspiece with damp rawhide that would shrink as it dried, rigid iron and living leather. Miriam ran her thumb over the joint. "It will move in the wind," Tomas said. "That is why it will not break." She thought about the sentence long after they returned to the house. As his strength returned, he began teaching her what he knew of the high desert. He showed her how the underside of a creosote leaf changed before rain, and how deer trails bent toward cooler stone near hidden seepage. He could kneel in apparently empty ground and find where a lizard had crossed hours earlier. Miriam taught him figures. He had worked as a scout for soldiers, ranchers, and tribal families, but the merchant's system of interest amused and offended him. One evening she used pinto beans to explain the debt on the winter feed. "This pile is what I borrowed," she said. "These 3 are what Arthur charges for waiting." Tomas flicked one bean across the table. "He sells time, in a manner of speaking. Then he owns too much. It is legal. So is the sun. It still burns a foolish man." She closed the ledger and looked at the dark columns of numbers. Daniel had trusted Arthur Vane because Arthur spoke softly and wore clean cuffs. After Daniel's death, the merchant had offered extensions that looked generous until the interest was added. Miriam had paid most of it through preserves, smoked meat, and cattle, but the last balance remained. Tomas touched the page. "This mark binds your water, your animals, your house, if I fail long enough. Then this paper is a weapon." Yes, he considered that with a scout's seriousness. The following Tuesday, Miriam loaded a crate of plum preserves and smoked venison into the wagon. Tomas stood near the hitching post with one crutch. "You should not go alone," he said. "I have gone alone for 20 years. That is not an answer. It has always served as one." His eyes narrowed. But he knew the leg would not survive the trip. Miriam left before he could suggest cutting it off and coming anyway. Red Mesa grew quiet when she drove in. Conversations did not stop entirely. They dropped in volume, forcing her to hear the effort people made not to stare. Agnes Bell crossed the street rather than meet her. 2 boys followed the wagon until their mother called them back. Arthur Vane's mercantile was cool and smelled of coffee beans, lamp oil, wool, and pickling brine. Tin signs hung from the rafters. Barrels of flour lined one wall. Lila stood near the ribbons with 2 friends. Arthur remained behind the counter, polishing his spectacles. "Mrs. Hail, Arthur." She set the crate down. He lifted one jar and held it toward the window. "Plum, 32 jars, 6 pounds of venison, both listed at last month's prices. Prices change, not after delivery is agreed." Arthur smiled without warmth. "You have become exact. I have always been exact. You have only recently had reason to dislike it." Lila and her friends whispered. Arthur lowered his voice. "There is concern about the man staying on your property. There is gossip. The sheriff says he may be dangerous. He was nearly dead when I found him. Dangerous men are often nearly dead." Miriam opened the ledger she had brought and pointed to a line. "You credited me 12 cents less per jar in April than our written agreement. Correct that, and we can discuss the venison." Arthur's eyes hardened. He had expected shame, perhaps tears, not arithmetic. "Is he an Apache scout? He is a man with a broken leg." Lila laughed softly behind her glove. Miriam turned. The young woman was dressed in pale blue, the color of expensive china. Her hands were smooth. A silver brooch held her collar. "What is funny?" Miriam asked. Lila's cheeks brightened. "Nothing." "Then keep it to yourself." The store went still. Arthur cleared his throat. "You cannot expect people not to wonder. A widow of your age, living alone with a young—" Miriam placed both palms on the counter. "A widow of my age owns 280 acres, pays her accounts, and sells goods you cannot keep on your shelves. Speak about the transaction or do not speak." Arthur corrected the ledger. After he weighed the venison, Miriam walked to the rear shelves. She had intended to buy salt, lamp wicks, and 2 pounds of coffee. Instead, she stopped at a roll of dark oil-tanned leather. It was thick, supple, and nearly free of scars. Good enough for saddle repairs, boots, or a new belt. The price tag was high. She thought of Tomas sharpening her knives, binding her fence, and trying to stand when Agnes came to the door. Miriam carried the leather to the counter. Arthur glanced from the hide to her face. "That is more than your credit." "I know." She took coins from a pouch inside her apron. They were part of the money she had saved for winter. Lila watched with open interest now. "Is it for him?" she asked. Miriam counted the last coin. "It is for my ranch." That answer was true enough. When she returned home, Tomas was sitting beneath the porch roof, trimming a piece of cracked harness. His expression changed when he saw the leather. "You spent winter money. I spent my money." He touched the hide with careful fingers. "This is too fine for patching. Then make something that deserves it." He looked up at her. The moment lengthened. Miriam became aware of the dust on her face, the loose hair at her temple, and the years between them. She had seen herself reflected in town windows that day. A plain woman in a charcoal dress, silver beginning at the roots, shoulders built by work rather than fashion. Tomas did not look toward the smooth skin or bright ribbons of Red Mesa. He looked at the small cut on her thumb. "You used the dull knife," he said. "It was sharp this morning. Then you held it badly. That is a brave accusation from a man who cannot cross the yard without a stick." He smiled. It transformed him. For a second he looked exactly his age. Miriam's pulse changed. She turned toward the barn before he could see. The leather became a belt first. Tomas cut it in long, clean strokes, beveled the edges with Miriam's smallest knife, and rubbed the surface with tallow until it darkened almost black. He used a brass buckle salvaged from his damaged gear. The finished belt held his knife, a repaired pouch, and a loop for cartridges he no longer possessed. He made Miriam a new harness strap from what remained. She found it hanging in the tack room one morning, fitted exactly to the old bay mare, and stitched with a narrow pattern of crossing lines. The work was so neat that Miriam ran one finger over it twice before buckling it into place. "You measured while I was asleep," she said when she returned to the porch. "I measured the broken strap. You knew where the holes should be. The horse told me. The horse does not speak. She complains clearly." Tomas no longer needed both crutches. By the 3rd week, he could move around the yard with a cane made from mesquite. The injured leg remained stiff, but it bore weight. He worked slowly and stopped before pain made him careless. Miriam admired that discipline. Daniel had often pushed past reason simply to prove he could, then left her to finish the work he had worsened. Tomas did not confuse stubbornness with strength. They settled into a routine no one had named. He checked tracks before dawn. She milked and started the stove. They ate corn cakes with molasses while the sky paled. During the worst heat, they repaired tools inside. In the evening, they worked outdoors again, when the shadows lengthened and the air smelled of warm cedar. One night they roasted rabbit over coals behind the house. Tomas spoke about his mother for the first time. She could find water where men saw stone, he said. Not magic. She watched birds, roots, insects, the way air cooled after sunset. "Is she living?" He turned the rabbit on the spit. "She died when soldiers moved our camp. Fever." Miriam waited. "She was older than the women in town who look at you with sorrow," he continued. "People came to her when children would not eat or horses refused a trail. Her years were useful." Miriam looked into the coals. "In Red Mesa, a woman's years are evidence against her, only if the people are foolish. They are not all foolish. No, some are afraid. Of what? A woman who no longer needs to be chosen." The answer landed more deeply than she wanted. Miriam had told herself she did not need anyone. The statement had been true when applied to money, shelter, or daily survival. It was less true in the quiet after supper, when Tomas sat close enough for her to hear the scrape of his knife against a plate. Need was not always weakness. Sometimes it was simply the name for a place another person had begun to occupy. She watched him lift the rabbit from the fire. His hands were scarred, his movements patient. He was 25, not 24 as she had first assumed. 16 years stood between them. The number felt enormous in town and small beneath the night sky. A few days later, Lila Vane rode out to the ranch. She arrived on a gray gelding wearing a green riding habit unsuited to dust. A small hat sat at an angle above her curls. She carried no food, no medicine, and no reason for the visit she was willing to state plainly. Miriam met her near the gate. My father sent me to ask about venison, Lila said. Your father has a clerk. He was busy. The answer is no. I have none ready. Lila's eyes moved past her. Tomas stood in the shade of the barn, shaping a replacement handle for the axe. He wore the new belt. His hair was tied back. The injury had left him leaner, but strength had returned to his shoulders. Lila smiled. I heard the man you rescued was a scout. He has a name. Tomas, is it? He looked up once, then returned to the axe handle. Lila dismounted. I have never seen anyone work cedar that way. Tomas shaved another thin curl from the wood. You have seen little cedar. She laughed, assuming he had made a joke for her. Miriam carried a feed bucket toward the barn. Lila followed. You must be terribly bored out here, the girl said to Tomas. There is music in town on Saturdays. My father has a gramophone from St. Louis. I have heard music, not like ours. No, he said, not like yours. The words held no invitation, but Lila stepped closer anyway. She asked about tracking, then about his people, then whether he had ever been to California. Her questions changed before his answers could finish. She wanted the outline of danger without the patience to understand the life inside it. Tomas set down the knife. Do you know why the grass is greener beneath that rock? He asked. Lila followed his finger toward a low shelf beyond the corral. Because it is shaded? The stone holds night cold. Moisture stays longer. Rabbits dig there. Coyotes wait above. Lila's attention wandered toward his hands. How interesting. You did not listen. The smile left her face. Miriam bent over the feed bin so neither of them would see her own. Lila mounted soon afterward. Before leaving, she turned to Tomas. If you tire of dust and old fences, Red Mesa has rooms with real beds. Tomas rested both hands on the axe handle. This bed is real. The gelding carried Lila away at a sharp trot. That evening, Miriam found Tomas near the well, rinsing cedar dust from his arms. She offered you comfort, Miriam said. She offered herself an adventure. You might have enjoyed one. He shut off the pump. You think I do not know my own mind? I think you are young, and you think youth is hunger without judgment. Miriam folded her arms. Often. He stepped closer. The limp was slight now, visible only when he was tired. Water ran from his fingertips into the dust. My mother chose my father when he had nothing but a lame horse and a blanket, he said. She was older. People laughed until winter came and they needed her knowledge. Then they stopped laughing and began asking for help. That is not Red Mesa. No, Red Mesa has not yet had enough winter. He walked past her. The words should have comforted Miriam. Instead, they left her unsettled. The following morning, Tomas gave her the turquoise. It was not polished or set in silver. The stone was a rough blue piece no larger than the end of her thumb, crossed by dark veins. He placed it on the ledger beside her hand. This came from a canyon north of the old agency, he said. My mother carried it. Miriam did not touch it. You should keep it. I did. Then why give it away? Because something kept is not always being used. She looked up. Tomas touched the stone with one finger. My people do not make the promises your minister makes. We watch what a person does when food is low, when weather turns, when no one praises the work. You stood in water for a stranger. You kept the fire through fever. You defended your door without asking permission. I know what you are. Miriam's throat tightened. What am I? The place a man returns to without being made smaller. The room seemed suddenly too narrow. She closed her fingers around the turquoise. It was cool and surprisingly heavy. Tomas, I cannot give you the years back. I did not lose them. You could have a wife who what? She struggled to say it without sounding like Agnes Bell. Who could give you more time, more children, a life that does not begin with mourning. His expression hardened, not in anger but in refusal. You speak with their voice. Miriam looked toward the window. He leaned both hands on the table. I am not blind to your years. I honor them. Do not turn my respect into ignorance because the town taught you to distrust being seen. He left before she found an answer. For 2 days she kept the stone in her apron pocket. Its weight followed her through chores. At night she set it beside the lamp, then hid it again when doubt rose. On the third evening she tried to return it. Tomas had come from the paddock carrying milk pails. Miriam waited near the porch with the turquoise in her palm. I cannot accept a promise you may regret. He set down the pails. You decide my regret now? No, I am trying not to steal your future. He came close enough that she could see the faint scar left by the flood along his temple. You pulled me from the wash because my life had value before you knew my name. Why does my choice have less value now that you know it? Miriam opened her mouth, then closed it. I have lived 25 years, he said. I have tracked men who lied to soldiers and soldiers who lied to themselves. I have buried friends younger than Lila Vane. Do not speak to me as though time has not touched me. The milk cooled between them. Miriam curled her fingers around the stone. Tomas lifted one of the pails and walked into the house. He did not ask whether she kept it. The matter might have remained private if Lila had accepted rejection. She did not. Within a week, Sheriff Silas Thorne rode to the ranch with 2 deputies. Miriam saw the dust and tucked the turquoise inside her collar. Tomas stood beside the barn, his hand resting near his knife. "Let me speak," she said. "This is your land, and your freedom they came to measure." Thorne dismounted slowly, arranging his face into concern. He was a broad man with a pale mustache, and a habit of resting his thumb on his holster whenever he wished to remind people that law traveled with him. "Miriam," he said, "I hoped we could settle this privately. There is nothing to settle. I have received reports of an armed Apache man on your property. He is not armed with a rifle. He carries a knife, so do I." One deputy looked away to hide a smile. Thorne's eyes moved to Tomas. "Name? Tomas Nantan." "Affiliation," Tomas answered calmly. "My own." The sheriff disliked the reply. "There have been thefts along the northern trail." "There have always been thefts along the northern trail," Miriam said. "You did not visit when Daniel's cattle disappeared." "That was different. Because my husband was alive?" Thorne stepped onto the first porch stair. "You are vulnerable here. A woman alone can be manipulated." Miriam felt Tomas behind her, still as a post. "I am not alone. That is exactly the problem." The words exposed him more than he intended. Miriam went inside and returned with the territorial statutes Daniel had once bought for a boundary dispute. She opened the book to a marked page. "Section 14, she said. "A property owner may shelter an injured traveler and employ any person not charged by warrant." "Do you have a warrant?" Thorne's jaw shifted. "No." "Do you have a charge?" "I have suspicion." "Then keep it on the road." One deputy coughed. Thorne's face reddened. "You are making enemies. I am refusing to invent authority for you." He leaned closer. "Red Mesa will not protect this ranch if trouble comes." Miriam shut the book. "Red Mesa has never protected it." The sheriff mounted and rode away hard enough to throw dust across the porch. Tomas watched until the riders vanished. "You knew the paper weapon," he said. "I learned where it cuts." He looked at her collar, where the edge of turquoise showed above the fabric. His gaze met hers. Neither mentioned the stone. By late summer, the valley began to fail. The winter rains had been light. Spring passed without runoff. Wells dropped foot by foot. Grass yellowed before seed. Cattle gathered near empty troughs and called through the night. At the Hail Ranch, Miriam rationed water and sold 6 animals before they weakened. Arthur Vane raised the price of feed. Red Mesa families lined barrels beneath church gutters and stared at a sky that offered nothing. Tomas walked the land every morning. He studied bird paths, insect mounds, the shape of shadows beneath rock. One evening he returned after dark with damp soil beneath his nails. "There is water in the North Canyon," he said. Miriam looked up from the ledger. "How much?" "Enough to matter." "Surface seep?" "Deeper." They carried tools beneath the moon. At the base of a red shelf, a single creosote bush grew greener than the plants around it. Tomas knelt and pointed to moths gathering low against the stone. "Cool air comes from below." Miriam examined the layers of limestone. Daniel had once spoken of an old channel running beneath the ranch, but he had drilled in the flatsets and found only dust. "The rock tilts east," she said. "If the channel exists, it may collect here." They began to dig. Tomas loosened soil with a pick. Miriam lifted it in buckets. At 3 feet, the dirt darkened. At 4, the air in the hole cooled. Near dawn, Miriam drove the spade beneath a shelf of compacted clay. Water seeped into the cut, not a rush. A dark shine first, then a thread moving steadily through the earth. Tomas touched 2 fingers to it. Miriam knelt beside him. They had found enough water to save the ranch. Perhaps enough to save the town that had tried to drive him from it. They spent the next week testing the spring. Miriam widened the cut and lined its sides with flat stone. Tomas followed the underground channel toward a narrow overhang where water collected in a shallow natural basin. Even in the afternoon heat, the rock there remained cool. They filled jars, marked the level, and returned at measured intervals. The spring recovered each time. "It will not supply every field," Miriam said. "It does not need to. It must keep animals alive until rain." They built a covered trough and laid a pipe toward the ranch yard. Miriam used the iron rig to lower stone into the trench. Tomas shaped cedar braces and packed clay around the joints. Their hands grew blistered. then hardened again. The water changed the ranch almost immediately. The horses drank without crowding. The remaining cattle stopped bellowing at night. Miriam planted a narrow row of beans beside the overflow ditch, more as a test than a hope, and green shoots appeared within days. News traveled without invitation. A hired hand from a neighboring place saw moisture in the trough. A child noticed that the Hail cattle still stood strong. Arthur Vane asked questions at the feed store. Sheriff Thorne sent a deputy along the county road twice. Miriam wanted to keep the spring hidden. Tomas did not argue. He merely watched the dust rising over Red Mesa each afternoon and said nothing. One evening they rode to the top of the southern ridge. From there the town looked small. A white church, dark roofs, the silver line of the dry public well. Smoke from cooking fires hung close to the ground. They would throw you out if they could, Miriam said. Yes, they would take the water and call it Providence. Yes. She turned toward him. Then why do you look as though I should offer it? Tomas rested his forearms on the saddle horn. When soldiers moved our people, there was a woman who refused water to a child because the child's father had stolen from her. The boy died. She kept her water 3 more days and died beside it. That is a cruel story. It is a true one. I am not responsible for every family in Red Mesa. No, his calm made her impatient. They mocked me. They threatened you. Arthur used Daniel's debt to press me. Silas called you a danger because Lila's pride was hurt. All true. You could help by disagreeing with me. I do not think you are wrong. Then what do you think? Tomas looked toward the town. I think water shows what kind of people we choose to become. Miriam sat with that. Below them the church bell rang once. Not for service. For another dry well. The next morning a woman named Rachel Moore arrived on foot leading a thin mule. Her husband was sick. Their well had turned to mud. She did not know about the spring for certain, but desperation had made her bold enough to ask. Miriam filled 2 barrels. Rachel cried when she saw the water. She tried to kneel in gratitude, but Miriam caught her by the arm. Bring the barrels back tomorrow. I have no money. I did not ask for money. By sunset 3 more families came. Miriam gave enough for drinking and livestock, never enough to waste. Tomas organized the line, checked containers for cracks, and showed men how to cover the barrels against evaporation. No one thanked him directly at first. They spoke to Miriam and avoided his eyes. On the 3rd day, a rancher named Calvin Price argued that his cattle deserved more because he owned more animals. Then you should have sold sooner, Miriam said. He swore and reached for the gate. Tomas stepped between them. He did not touch the man. He did not need to. Calvin looked at the scar on Tomas's temple, the knife at his belt, and the complete absence of anger in his face. Anger could be challenged. Tomas's stillness could not. The rancher took his allotted water and left. By Sunday, the spring had become the town's worst-kept secret. Miriam knew Thorne would eventually declare it a public necessity and seize control in the name of order. If she waited, he would frame their generosity as evidence that the water belonged to everyone and their ownership as obstruction. She took the gray dress from the wardrobe. It was the dress she had worn to Daniel's funeral, then to every church service afterward. The sleeves were plain. The high collar made her disappear. Miriam pinned the turquoise at her throat with a small wire loop. Tomas entered from the yard wearing a clean white shirt beneath his buckskin vest. His hair was tied with a strip from the leather she had bought. He stopped when he saw the stone. I am going to church, she said. So am I. They may arrest you. They may try. They may decide I am mad. They decided that before I came. She almost smiled. The wagon ride to Red Mesa felt longer than the distance justified. Dust rose behind the wheels. Heat rippled over the flats. Tomas sat beside her, one hand resting on his knee. The bad leg no longer required a brace, but rough ground still made him stiff. As they entered town, a man carrying a feed sack stopped in the middle of the street. 2 women froze outside the apothecary. Children pointed until their mothers pulled their hands down. Miriam kept the team moving. At the church, people gathered beneath the shade awning, fanning themselves with folded programs. Agnes Bell saw the wagon first. Her mouth opened, then shut. Lila stood nearby in pale yellow with Arthur Vane beside her. Tomas stepped down. The silence spread from person to person. Miriam had expected shame to arrive like fever. It did not. She was aware of her silver-threaded hair and the dust on the hem of her dress. She was also aware that the water barrels behind several houses had come from her spring. Tomas stood beside the wagon, not offering his arm as a gentleman in Red Mesa might. Instead, he waited until she had both feet firmly on the ground. It was a small courtesy, and because it was based on her balance rather than display, it felt intimate. They entered together. The hymn faltered. Miriam did not go to the last pew. She walked to the front, where Arthur Vane and the wealthiest families usually sat. The board sounded beneath her boots. Tomas followed with his head level, looking neither proud nor submissive. Sheriff Thorne stood near the pulpit. "This man cannot remain," he said before the minister could speak. Miriam sat. Tomas took the place beside her. Thorne's face darkened. "Mrs. Hale, I am giving you a lawful direction." "Under what law? This gathering has the right to safety." "So does he." A murmur traveled through the room. The sheriff placed one hand on his belt. "You have brought an armed outsider into a house of worship." Miriam looked at the revolver on his hip. "So have you." Someone in the rear laughed and quickly coughed. Thorne stepped into the aisle. "Do not turn this into a performance. You brought the audience." Arthur Vane rose. His face had become thinner during the drought. "Miriam, this is not the place. It is exactly the place. Everyone who has discussed my private life is already here." Agnes Bell lowered her eyes. Miriam stood. The turquoise caught a line of sunlight from the side window. "I have water on my land," she said. "A spring protected beneath limestone. It is enough to keep Red Mesa alive through the dry season if it is managed carefully." The room changed. People leaned forward. A baby cried once and was hushed. Arthur's lips parted. "How much water? Enough for drinking, household use, and limited livestock. Not enough for greed." Thorne recovered first. "A resource of that importance cannot be controlled by one woman and an Indian scout." Tomas's gaze moved to him. Miriam felt a cold clarity settle over her. "It is on my deeded land. The access road crosses my north pasture. The pipe, trough, and stonework were built by our hands. Public need changes the question. No. Public need makes the answer urgent." The minister gripped the edge of the pulpit but did not intervene. Miriam faced the congregation. "I will allow Red Mesa to draw water under written rules. Each household receives a measured amount. No person enters the North Canyon without permission. No one attempts to remove Tomas Nantan from my property without a valid warrant. No claim will be filed against the spring. In return, the town survives long enough to learn manners." A few men bristled. More looked at their wives and children. Arthur swallowed. "You would bargain with water?" "I would protect it from men who have already shown me how they behave when they think I am weak." Thorne pointed toward Tomas. "He found it. That gives the territory grounds to investigate weather." "I found the geological channel," Miriam said. "He read the surface signs. The spring exists because knowledge met labor. You have no claim to either." Lila rose so quickly her bench scraped. "You are doing all this for him." Miriam looked at the young woman. "No, I am doing it with him. You should learn the difference." Color rushed into Lila's face. From the back of the church, Rachel Moore stood. "My children drank because Mrs. Hale gave us water." Then Calvin Price rose reluctantly. "My herd got 2 barrels. The scout kept order when I did not." Other voices followed. Not affection, necessity, testimony. Thorne looked around and saw his authority thinning. Arthur removed his spectacles and wiped them. "Let us see the spring." Miriam nodded. 1 wagon from each district, clean barrels. "No weapons drawn on my land." Thorne said, "I carry my weapon everywhere. Then you can wait in town." The procession left an hour later. Tomas rode at the front on the chestnut mare, whose hind leg had healed with only a faint stiffness. Miriam rode beside him. Behind them came wagons, riders, and empty barrels that rattled like bones. The heat was brutal. Men who had once called Tomas savage followed the signs he gave with his hand. He led them around loose shale, through a cut where the shadows saved the horses, and across a flat where the crust looked solid but concealed deep sand. At the entrance to the North Canyon, he dismounted. Arthur tried to push ahead. Tomas stopped him with one raised palm. "The rock is narrow, one at a time." Arthur obeyed. Inside, cool air moved over their faces. The sound of dripping water reached them before the spring came into view. Miriam had enlarged the basin, and the overflow now fed a stone trough. Clear water reflected the dark roof of the overhang. For several seconds no one spoke. Arthur knelt and drank from his cupped hands. Agnes, who had ridden in Rachel's wagon, began to cry quietly. Even Thorne had come after all, leaving his revolver locked in Arthur's store. He stood apart, staring at the water as if it had personally contradicted him. Miriam showed the measuring marks carved into the trough, 1 mark per household each day. Animals receive water by count. Sick families first. Anyone who damages the channel loses access. Calvin Price said, "Who decides? I do." Men shifted. Tomas stepped into the light beside her. Miriam continued. Tomas keeps the route and watches the spring. Rachel records the households. Arthur provides barrel hoops at cost. The churchyard will be the distribution point for those unable to travel. Arthur looked startled at being assigned useful work. What does the sheriff do? Someone asked. Miriam looked toward Thorn. He makes certain no one steals from the line. The answer allowed him a fragment of dignity without returning control. He understood the choice. Agreed, he said. The word was quiet. That evening, loaded wagons rolled back toward Red Mesa. Men asked Tomas where to place weight on steep descents. Women tied wet cloth around children's necks. The same people who had stared at him in church now depended on his judgment to bring the water home. No one apologized. Miriam had not expected them to. Respect in hard country often arrived without ceremony. It showed itself when a proud man followed directions, when a merchant accepted limits, when a sheriff kept his hand away from his gun. At the ranch, Tomas cleaned the chestnut's hooves while Miriam entered the day's amounts in her ledger. We saved them, she said. For now. They will still talk. Yes. She touched the turquoise at her collar. Does that trouble you? Tomas looked up from the horse. No. Why not? Talk is what people make when they have not learned to build. Miriam closed the ledger. Outside, water moved through the new pipe with a soft, steady sound. For the first time since Daniel's death, the house did not feel like something she had defended from emptiness. It felt like the center of a life still being made. For 12 days, the water rules held. Every morning before sunrise, wagons formed a line beyond the south fence. Rachel Moore checked names against the list. Tomas inspected barrels and sent away any man who tried to hide an extra container beneath a tarp. Miriam measured the spring level at noon and again after sunset. Arthur Vane supplied hoops and pitch without raising the price, partly because the town watched him now, and partly because his own store could not survive without water. The arrangement saved Red Mesa. It also made the Hail Ranch valuable in a new and dangerous way. Men began appearing at the mercantile who did not belong to the valley. They asked how many riders guarded the North Canyon. They bought cartridges, dried beef, and lamp oil. One of them had a scar that pulled the left corner of his mouth downward. Lila saw him speaking to Sheriff Thorne behind the saloon and carried the story home, not out of loyalty to Miriam, but because she feared losing control of a scandal she had started. Thorne rode to the ranch near dusk. This time he came alone. Miriam met him by the trough. Tomas stood farther off, repairing a stirrup, apparently uninterested. There are men north of the county line, Thorne said. They call themselves the Cinder Creek outfit. Raiders? Cattle thieves when cattle are worth stealing. Hired guns when someone has money. Who hired them? Thorne looked toward the house. I do not know. Miriam heard the lie, but she also heard fear beneath it. How many? Maybe 10? Maybe 15. Will the town send men? They will defend the church distribution point. Not the spring. Most cannot leave their families. Miriam almost smiled at the familiar shape of abandonment. Thorne shifted in the saddle. You should come into town. Bring what water you can and leave the ranch until this passes. And hand them the source? You cannot hold this place. Tomas spoke without looking up. You could not find this place without us. Thorne's face tightened. I came to warn you. Miriam studied him. The sheriff's pride had not disappeared, but the drought had cracked it. He knew a raid on the spring would destroy his authority as surely as it destroyed the town. Post 2 men at the south road, she said. If riders flee toward Red Mesa, keep them away from the distribution barrels. You are giving me orders now. I am giving you useful work. Thorne stared, then gave a short breath through his nose. I will place 4. When he left, Tomas finished the stitch he was making before speaking. He knows who paid them. So do I. Arthur? No. Arthur is greedy, but he needs the town alive. Someone wants the ranch more than the water. Tomas glanced toward the northern ridge. Thorne? He wanted me frightened enough to sell before the drought. But if he hired men, he would not warn us. Leela? Miriam shook her head. She wants attention, not graves. They both thought of the same possibility. A land company from Tucson had approached Miriam twice after Daniel's death. Their agent had offered cash for the north pasture, claiming the rock held copper. She had refused. If they now knew about the spring, the land was worth 10 times more. The answer did not matter before the attack. Preparation did. Tomas walked the entire perimeter after dark. He marked 3 approaches: the dry wash from the west, the shale pass north of the spring, and the low saddle beyond the barn. Raiders would avoid the south road where Thorne's men waited. Miriam showed him the crawl space beneath the porch, the old root cellar behind the kitchen, and a narrow opening in the loft from which Daniel had once shot coyotes. They moved water barrels away from the walls. They soaked blankets and laid them near the roof ladder. Miriam carried cartridges from a locked chest and counted them on the table. 38 rifle rounds. 21 revolver rounds. Tomas had recovered a carbine from a rancher who owed them for water. He checked its action, cleaned the barrel, and placed 5 cartridges in a row. "We do not shoot at sound," he said. "We see the target. I know how to use a rifle." "I know. I am reminding both of us." They worked without waste. At the spring, Tomas strung small bells made from bent tin along 2 hidden lines. He scattered dry seed pods in the narrowest trail and placed a loose board across the old wash. Any rider approaching quietly would still make the land speak. Miriam moved the horses into the stone corral. She opened the chicken run so the birds could scatter if fire reached the yard. She carried Daniel's papers, the ledger, and the turquoise into the root cellar, then stopped. The stone did not belong underground. She pinned it at her throat. At sunset they ate beans and cornbread at the kitchen table. Neither was hungry. "If they take the spring," Miriam said, "Red Mesa has perhaps 4 days. They will not take it. If they kill us, the town may bargain." Tomas set down his spoon. "You are speaking as though death is already seated here. I am speaking as a person who has buried someone, and I am speaking as one who has buried many. Death does not need an invitation." His hand crossed the table and covered hers. It was the first time he had touched her with no practical reason. Miriam looked at their joined hands. His skin was darker, his fingers longer, but the calluses met in the same places. "I kept the stone," she said. "I saw. I do not know what promise I can make. Make the one you can keep tonight." "What is that?" "Stand with me." She turned her hand beneath his and held on. After midnight, the tin bells sounded once, not a ring. A small metallic tremor carried on the wind. Tomas rose from the floor beside the back door. Miriam was already awake, sitting against the bedroom wall with the rifle across her lap. He raised 2 fingers, pointed west, then 3 toward the north. More than one group. Miriam moved to the front room. Moonlight silvered the yard. The air had cooled enough that she could smell horse sweat before she heard bridles. A voice called from the darkness. "Mrs. Hail, we only want to talk." Miriam recognized the scarred man from Arthur's store. She did not answer. "We have papers," he continued. "This land has been claimed by the Western Mineral and Water Company. You leave peacefully. You will be paid." Tomas had expected a false legal claim. He had told her not to argue with men who brought documents at midnight. Miriam rested the rifle on the window frame. The man rode into view, holding a folded sheet in one hand. 3 riders spread behind him. "Come closer so I can read it," she called. He smiled and advanced. The loose board in the wash snapped beneath a horse's hoof. At the same moment, the bells on the north line shook. Tomas fired from the barn loft. His shot struck the lead rider's shoulder and spun him from the saddle. Miriam fired at the lantern carried by the man with the paper. Glass burst. Darkness swallowed the group. Gunfire answered from 2 sides. A bullet tore through the window frame, spraying Miriam with wood splinters. She dropped below the sill, worked the lever, and shifted to the second firing slit Tomas had cut behind a cupboard. Outside, horses screamed. Men shouted conflicting orders. The attackers had expected an isolated widow and an injured scout. They had not expected crossfire from 2 elevations or a yard arranged to break their line of sight. Tomas moved along the loft without showing more than the edge of his shoulder. He fired only when a rider crossed open ground. Each shot changed the raid's shape. 1 man fell. Another horse bolted riderless toward the south road. A flaming bottle struck the porch roof. Fire spread through the dry shingles. Miriam grabbed a wet blanket, climbed the short ladder inside the attic, and beat at the flames while bullets struck the outer wall. Smoke filled her mouth. The blanket grew hot in her hands. Below, the front door shook beneath a heavy blow. Once, twice, the crossbar cracked. Miriam left the roof half smothered and descended as the door burst inward. A raider entered with a revolver raised. She fired from the stairs. The shot drove him backward onto the porch. Another man reached through the broken opening. Miriam swung the rifle butt into his wrist. Bone snapped or wood did, she could not tell. He cursed and fell away. A shot sounded behind the house. Then another. Tomas had left the loft. Miriam's stomach tightened, but she stayed at the door. Trust meant holding her position, not chasing him into darkness. Smoke moved through the room. A curtain caught fire. She tore it down and stamped it beneath her boots. Outside, Tomas circled behind the stone corral. He had seen 3 men moving toward the spring path with powder kegs. They did not intend merely to seize the water. They meant to collapse the channel if they could not control it. He crawled through sage until he was close enough to hear them. "Set both charges under the shelf," one whispered. "Vale wants the deed, not a hole. Vale wants the widow begging." The name fixed the answer. Ephraim Vale, the land agent from Tucson. Tomas rose behind a rock and fired. The man carrying the first keg dropped it. Powder spilled into the dust. The others scattered. One charged Tomas with a knife. They collided near the trough. Tomas's bad leg buckled under the impact. He hit the ground, lost the carbine, and caught the attacker's wrist with both hands. The knife descended inch by inch. The raider grinned. Widow's pet, Tomas shifted his weight, drove a knee into the man's ribs and rolled. Pain tore through the healed fracture. The world flashed white. The knife cut his sleeve. He found a loose stone and struck once. The attacker collapsed. Tomas rose unsteadily. Across the yard, the scarred leader had taken cover behind the rain barrel, his rifle pointed toward Miriam's window. Miriam saw the barrel first. She fired through the wall beside him, not to hit but to drive him out. He moved exactly as Tomas had predicted, toward the open strip between the house and corral. Tomas shot. The leader fell face down in the dust. For several seconds, the remaining men continued firing. Then someone shouted that Vale was dead. Whether the dead man was truly Ephraim Vale or only his foreman, panic spread faster than any order. Riders turned toward the West Wash. At the South Road, Sheriff Thorne's deputies fired warning shots. 2 raiders abandoned their horses and fled into the brush. Others scattered north. The yard grew quiet in pieces. One last gunshot came from the ridge, then nothing but the crackle of burning shingles and the wild breathing of animals. Miriam stepped onto the porch. Tomas, no answer. She crossed the yard, rifle ready. He appeared beside the trough, limping badly, one sleeve dark with blood. Miriam ran to him, the leg, still mine, the arm, a cut. She touched his face with both hands before realizing what she had done. He leaned into the contact. Behind them, flame climbed again along the roof edge. They separated and carried water together. By dawn, the house still stood. The porch roof was blackened. 2 windows were gone. The barn door hung crooked. Bullet holes marked the wall beside Daniel's old clock. The spring remained clear. Sheriff Thorne arrived with 6 townsmen after sunrise. They found 3 dead raiders, 2 wounded, and documents in a saddlebag bearing the seal of the Western Mineral and Water Company. One letter promised payment to Silas Thorne for cooperation after transfer. Miriam watched him read it, his face drained. "I did not take money," he said. "You considered it. I told Vale I would not remove you without a court order, but you let him believe the road was open." Thorne looked toward the burned roof. "Yes." The admission cost him. Miriam handed the letter to Arthur Vane, who had come with the wagons. "Make copies. Send one to the territorial judge." Thorne did not object. The townmen spent the morning repairing what they could. Calvin Price reset the barn hinge. Arthur replaced broken glass with oiled canvas. Rachel brought bandages. Agnes Bell arrived carrying bread again, but this time she set it down and picked up a bucket without asking to enter. No one called Tomas a danger. They had seen the powder kegs near the spring. They knew who had protected their water. Near noon, Leela Vane arrived in her father's carriage. She wore blue silk and white gloves as though she had dressed for a visit rather than an aftermath. Her face changed when she saw the bodies covered near the fence, but she continued toward the porch. Tomas sat on the step while Miriam wrapped his arm. His shirt was open at the shoulder. Soot marked his cheek. Lila stopped before him. "You cannot stay here," she said. Miriam tied the bandage and rose. Leela ignored her. "My father has rooms above the store. The sheriff is finished. These men may return. Come to town, Tomas. You could work for us. You would be safe." Tomas looked past her at the blackened house, the broken door, and the people repairing the yard. "This is where I work." Lila's voice sharpened. "You nearly died for an old woman's land." Miriam felt the words, but not in the old way. They no longer found an open wound. Tomas stood. He favored the injured leg, yet he seemed taller than Lila remembered. "I nearly died in the flood," he said. "Miriam gave me life before she asked what I could give her." Lila looked toward the townspeople, aware of the audience. "You owe her gratitude. That is not love." Tomas took Miriam's hand. The gesture was simple, public, final. "You think love is being admired," he said. "I think it is knowing who will remain when the roof burns." Lila's mouth trembled. She is 16 years older than you. Yes. She cannot give you what I can. You have offered nothing I need. A silence opened around them. Tomas lifted Miriam's hand slightly, not as a display but as recognition. She knows the weight of water. She knows where a house fails in wind. She knows how to stand when men arrive with laws they invented at midnight. Her years are not a lack. They are what made her ready. Leela looked at Miriam with anger, then confusion. For the first time, perhaps, she understood that youth could not win a contest it had imagined alone. She returned to the carriage. Arthur called after her, but she did not stop. Miriam watched the wheels disappear beyond the fence. You did not have to answer her, she said. Yes, you could have let her leave with dignity. She came without it. Despite the smoke and exhaustion, Miriam laughed. Tomas's fingers tightened around hers. The sound carried across the damaged yard, startling a flock of sparrows from the barn roof. For the rest of that day, Red Mesa repaired the ranch it had once been willing to abandon. The work was not graceful. Men argued over the angle of the new porch beam. Children carried nails and aprons and spilled half of them in the yard. Agnes Bell burned a pot of coffee because she forgot it while helping Rachel wash blood from the kitchen floor. Arthur Vane complained about the cost of glass until Miriam reminded him that 3 of the bullets had come through windows, protecting his water. By evening, the house could be closed against weather again. Sheriff Thorne returned to town under no guard, but no longer as sheriff. He left his badge on Miriam's table before he rode away. I thought law was the same as being obeyed, he said. Miriam looked at the scratched piece of tin. Most people do until obedience fails. He nodded once. What will you do? Answer to the judge. After that, perhaps find work where a badge is not required. Tomas watched him go. You believe him? He asked. I believe shame can change a person. I do not know whether it will. They kept the badge in the ledger drawer until the territorial marshal arrived 2 weeks later. The marshal read Vale's letters, examined the powder kegs, and took testimony from half the town. Arthur Vane produced copies of every land offer Vale had made. Rachel described the water distribution. Calvin Price admitted, with painful honesty, that he had once tried to take more than his share and that Tomas had stopped him without violence. The marshal arrested the wounded raiders and issued warrants for 2 company officers in Tucson. He also recorded Miriam's spring as an improved private water source under territorial law. The paper mattered. It did not matter as much as the stonework, the rifles, or the people who had finally stood in the yard, but it meant the spring could not be stolen with a clerk's stamp. When the marshal left, quiet returned slowly. The drought continued, though clouds began gathering over the mountains each afternoon. Red Mesa still depended on the spring. The line of wagons became orderly enough that children played while waiting. Tomas trained 2 young men to watch the route and taught Rachel how to measure changes in flow. Miriam expanded the ledger into a record of rainfall, household needs, and repairs. At night, she and Tomas worked on the house. They replaced the burned shingles with cedar soaked in clay. They fitted a stronger crossbar to the door. Tomas carved a small wooden plug for the bullet hole beside the clock, but Miriam stopped him before he pressed it in. Leave one, she said. Why? So I remember what walls are for. He touched the edge of the hole and understood. The turquoise remained pinned to her collar most days. It caught flour, dust, sweat, and smoke. Miriam stopped polishing it. Its roughness suited the life around it. One morning, Tomas led her to the ridge above the wash. The storm season had not yet broken, but wind moved cooler there. He carried a shallow clay bowl filled with spring water. Miriam carried nothing. At the place where red stone opened toward the valley, he cleared a circle in the dirt. My mother's people made promises with families present, he said. My family is gone or far away. Miriam looked toward Red Mesa. Mine would come if invited. Then Agnes would bring cake, and the minister would spend an hour deciding where you should stand. Tomas's mouth moved. I do not need their permission, she said. He set the bowl between them. I cannot offer the marriage your law understands. I can file a record with the judge later. I cannot offer a large house. I have one that leaks only in 2 places now. I may be called away to help my people. Then you will go and return if you can. He looked at her carefully. You do not promise obedience. No. Good. Miriam knelt opposite him. Tomas poured a little water into his palm and touched it to the earth. The dust darkened. He pressed his hand to the ground, then offered the bowl to her. She did the same. Water and soil marked both of them. I choose the woman who pulled me from the flood, he said. The woman who knows numbers, weather, animals, grief, and the limits of foolish men. I choose the years that made her. I choose the work that comes with her. Miriam's eyes burned. She had once repeated vows written by another man. This time she spoke slowly. I choose the man who saw me when I had made myself invisible. I choose your people, even when I do not understand them, your silences, even when they trouble me, your judgment when it is wiser than mine, and your return when the road allows it. I will not ask you to become smaller so the town can be comfortable. Tomas took the turquoise from her collar. For one frightened moment she thought he meant to reclaim it. Instead, he threaded it onto a narrow leather cord and tied it around her neck so the stone rested above her heart. Then he kissed her. There was no choir, no witness except hawks and the vast open land. His mouth was warm and careful. Miriam had expected the difference in their ages to enter even that moment, to make her self-conscious or cautious. It did not. There was only the solid pressure of his hand at the back of her neck, and the astonishing fact that desire had not died, simply because other people had stopped imagining it for her. When they returned to the ranch, Rachel Moore was waiting with the water ledger. She looked from the clay on their hands to the leather cord at Miriam's throat. "Oh," Rachel said. Miriam lifted one eyebrow. Rachel smiled. "I suppose I should add another household name." Word reached town before sunset. Agnes Bell arrived the next day carrying a cake. "This is not a pity cake," she said quickly. "What kind is it?" "An apology, perhaps." Miriam took the plate. Agnes stared at the turquoise. "I was cruel. Yes. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting the rules that made you comfortable." Agnes accepted that without defense. "May I come in?" Miriam stepped aside. It was the first time Agnes entered the house since Daniel's funeral. The marriage record was filed 3 weeks later before a circuit judge who asked Tomas 3 times whether he understood the age difference. Tomas answered the 3rd time. "Do you?" The judge stopped asking. The first rain fell the following night. It began with a soft tapping on the roof. Miriam woke and lay still, afraid the sound would vanish. Then thunder rolled beyond the ridge, and water struck the house in a sudden silver sheet. She and Tomas ran outside barefoot. The yard turned dark. Dust released the smell it had held all summer. Rachel's children shouted from the road. In town, the church bell rang without order. Tomas lifted his face to the rain. Miriam stood beside him, her nightdress plastered to her legs, laughing until she could not breathe. The drought did not end in one storm, but the land began to recover. Grass appeared in the washes. The public wells rose. Cattle that survived grew strong again. Red Mesa no longer needed the spring every day. Miriam kept the system. "Another dry year will come," she said. "Memory is shortest after relief." They built stone-lined irrigation channels from the overflow and planted corn, beans, squash, and a row of young cottonwoods. Tomas brought seeds from families north of the mountains. Miriam traded preserves for tools and hired 2 widows from town during harvest, paying them the same rate Arthur paid men in his warehouse. The ranch became a place people visited for reasons beyond water. A woman whose husband had disappeared came asking for work. A mixed-blood boy, unwanted by relatives, stayed in the bunkhouse and learned horses. 2 Apache cousins of Tomas spent a winter there, while negotiating grazing rights. Rachel became the keeper of the water records, and proved more exact than Miriam. Not everyone approved. Approval became less important. 5 years after the flood, the north pasture was green enough to be seen from the church ridge. A 4-year-old boy sat beneath the iron lifting rig, tapping the frame with a stick. His name was Samuel Hail Naunton, though his father called him Little Quail because he ran low and fast through brush. Miriam sat on the porch shelling beans. She was 46. Silver had spread through her hair, and a deep line had formed between her brows from squinting at ledgers. Her body had changed after Samuel's birth. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the town doctor had warned her so often about her age that she finally ordered him out of the house during labor. Rachel had delivered the boy. Tomas had waited outside until Miriam called his name. Samuel now had his father's watchful eyes and his mother's determination to touch every machine within reach. "Leave the brake pin alone," Miriam called. His hand froze. "I was looking. You were looking with your fingers." He grinned and moved to the safer side of the frame. Hoofbeats sounded beyond the ridge. Samuel became still. Tomas had taught him to listen before reacting. The boy placed one palm on the ground, a solemn imitation that made Miriam hide a smile. "One horse," he announced. "Whose?" Samuel listened. "Papa's." A rider appeared moments later. Tomas crossed the yard on the chestnut mare, older now but still steady. He dismounted and knelt beside Samuel before greeting anyone else. From the dust, he showed the boy where a coyote had passed in the night. Miriam watched them together. Love, she had learned, rarely resembled the wedding songs of Red Mesa. It was Tomas checking the roof before storms. It was the best portion of meat left on her plate without comment. It was his return from every long ride and her lamp in the window. It was argument without humiliation, silence without punishment, work divided according to skill rather than pride. Tomas looked up and caught her watching. The same calm regard passed between them that had begun beside a sickbed years earlier. He came to the porch and kissed her temple. "Arthur and Agnes are on the road," he said. "For water? For advice. That is more dangerous." The carriage arrived within the hour. Arthur Vane had grown thinner and less certain of his importance. Agnes's black hair had gone almost entirely gray. They carried maps and a proposal from Red Mesa's council. The town wanted to expand the spring system into 3 community cisterns and build catchments along the ridge. They wanted Miriam to oversee the accounts and Tomas to choose the routes. Arthur unfolded the map on her table. "We would pay you both," he said. Miriam examined the figures. "You calculated interest on materials." Arthur flushed. "It is standard." She took a pencil and crossed out the charge. "Not when the town is lending to itself." Tomas leaned over the map and moved one planned cistern half a mile east. "Why?" Arthur asked. "The ground there cracks after hard rain. The surveyor did not note that. The surveyor came in winter." Agnes watched them. Years earlier, she would have been embarrassed to receive instruction from the couple she had judged. Now she took notes. The cistern project took 2 seasons. It survived the next drought. By then, people no longer referred to the ranch as Daniel Hale's place. It became the Nantan Hale Ranch on maps and simply Miriam's spring in conversation. Young men from town came to learn stonework from Tomas. Women came to study Rachel's water ledgers and Miriam's preservation methods. Lila Vane married a banker from Tucson and left Red Mesa. Before departing, she visited once. She stood at the gate in a traveling dress, less bright than the girl who had ridden out to inspect Tomas years before. "I was hateful," she said. Miriam waited. "I thought beauty was a kind of right. It is a kind of luck." Lila looked toward the yard where Tomas was showing Samuel how to mend rawhide. "He would never have chosen me." No. The honesty hurt, but it also freed something in Lila's face. "I hope I become useful," she said. Miriam opened the gate. "Then begin before you need applause." They drank coffee on the porch. After Lila left, Tomas asked what she had wanted. To stop being the girl she was. Can she? Miriam watched the carriage diminish along the road. Perhaps. People move when the ground beneath them finally becomes uncomfortable. Tomas nodded. They returned to work. 40 years after the flood, the iron lifting rig was gone. Its timber frame had rotted at the base despite every coat of oil. Tomas had dismantled it piece by piece, saving the gears and hooks. Some of the iron became hinges for the new barn. The main wheel was mounted beneath the porch roof, not as decoration but as memory. By then the ranch had outgrown the boundaries Miriam once defended alone. Cottonwoods marked the irrigation ditches. 3 houses stood beyond the original barn. A schoolroom occupied the old bunkhouse. Families who had begun as hired hands or displaced travelers had built lives along the spring channels. Red Mesa had changed as well. The church installed wide doors and a shaded water station. The council kept drought records. A woman served as sheriff. Arthur Vane's mercantile belonged to his granddaughter, who posted prices openly and did not charge widows more slowly than she charged men. Change had not made people perfect. It had made some cruelties harder to call tradition. Miriam sat in a cedar rocker on the porch, 81 years old and unwilling to be treated as fragile. Her hands had stiffened. She no longer lifted grain sacks, and walking to the North Canyon required a cart, but she still corrected water figures without spectacles, and could hear a failing pump before younger people noticed. The turquoise rested against her chest, its edges smoothed by decades of touch. Tomas came through the screen door carrying one yellow flower. He was 65. His hair had turned silver, and the old break in his leg troubled him in cold weather. He still moved quietly enough to startle visitors. Each spring he brought Miriam the first brittle bush bloom he found, a custom begun after the raid. He placed it in her lap. "You stole that from the west slope," she said. "It grew on our side of the fence. The fence moved in '32. Then the flower was confused." She laughed. Across the yard, Samuel's eldest daughter was arguing with her younger brother about a saddle. Millicent was 17, long-limbed and impatient, with a mind quick enough to become dangerous if no one taught it patience. She climbed the porch steps carrying a letter. "It came from Tucson," she said. "The normal school accepted me." Miriam read the page. "That is what you wanted." Millicent sat on the lower step. "Mama says I should be happy. You are not?" "I am. But Mr. Harlan asked whether I intend to teach until I marry. He said educated women frighten men who want peaceful homes." Tomas sat beside Miriam's chair. "Does Mr. Harlan have a peaceful home?" he asked. "His wife left last year. Then he speaks as an expert in failure." Millicent smiled, but worry remained. "There is a boy in Tucson," she said. "He writes to me. He says he admires ambition. But when I told him I might teach in the territorial schools, he asked who would keep his house." Miriam folded the acceptance letter carefully. "What did you answer?" "That he could." Tomas looked pleased. "He has not written since," Millicent added. "Then the mail has done you a service," Miriam said. The girl leaned her head against the porch post. "What if no one wants a woman who refuses to be easy?" Miriam touched the turquoise. At 41, she had asked the same question in a different form. She had thought love belonged to women who had not yet been weathered. She had almost returned the one promise, made by a man who understood exactly what weathering meant. She untied the leather cord. The stone felt warm from her skin. Tomas watched but did not stop her. Miriam placed the turquoise in Millicent's palm. The girl stared. "Grandmother, I cannot take this. You can carry it until you know whether it belongs with you." It was his mother's, and then his, then mine. An object can survive more than one life without betraying any of them. Millicent traced the dark veins. "What am I supposed to remember?" That being wanted is not the same as being valued. The yard quieted around them, or perhaps Miriam's hearing simply narrowed. "A person may admire your face, your youth, your silence, or the way you make his life convenient," she continued. "None of those things tells you whether he sees you. The one worth building with will notice what you know, what you endure, and what you refuse to surrender. He will not ask you to cut away your strongest parts so he can call the remainder gentle." Millicent closed her fingers around the stone. "And if no such person comes, then build the life anyway." Tomas reached for Miriam's hand. She continued, "A home is work before it is romance. It is water carried, accounts kept, roofs mended, wrongs admitted, and doors opened carefully. Do not choose someone because the town applauds the picture. Choose the person who remains useful when the picture burns." Millicent looked from Miriam to Tomas. "Is that what happened to you?" "No," Miriam said. "First I pulled him out of a flood. After that he became difficult to remove." Tomas gave her the offended look he had perfected over 4 decades. Millicent laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. She left for Tucson at the end of summer with the turquoise wrapped in a square of cloth. Miriam missed its weight immediately. For several nights her hand rose to an empty place at her throat. Tomas noticed. "You regret giving it?" "No. You reach for it. I reached for you when you were gone scouting too. I returned. So will the stone, perhaps. Or it will go where it is needed." Autumn came dry and bright. The family harvested corn. Children filled the yard. Miriam directed more than she worked, which required a humility she had never found easy. She watched Samuel repair a wagon using one of the old rig's gears as a temporary brace. She watched Rachel Moore's grandson update the spring ledger at the kitchen table. She watched women own land in their own names. One afternoon, Arthur Vane's granddaughter arrived with 2 council members and a map. They asked Miriam and Tomas where to place a new reservoir. Miriam examined the contour lines, then pointed to a low saddle north of town. "The soil is wrong there," one councilman said. "It was wrong when your surveyor looked. Dig 6 feet and test again." They did. The layer beneath held compact clay, exactly as Miriam remembered from a trench cut 50 years earlier. The reservoir was built there and did not leak. No one called her a widow past her usefulness. People called her when the land confused them. Near the end of winter, Miriam asked Tomas to take her to the wash. They rode in a small cart Samuel had built, slow enough that every stone made the wheels complain. Wildflowers covered the place where the flood had once torn through the ranch. The old bank had softened. Willows grew in a curve along the channel. Tomas helped her down. She stood with one hand on his arm and looked toward the bend where she had first seen the trapped horse. "I was angry that day," she said. "At the flood? At the wedding, at Agnes, at Daniel for dying, at myself for believing them." Tomas considered this. Anger gave you strength. No, the rig gave me strength. Anger made me reckless enough to use it. He smiled. They walked to the water's edge. The channel was shallow now, clear over brown stones. Miriam's knees hurt. Tomas's breath came more slowly than it once had. Yet the silence between them remained full rather than empty, shaped by every argument, birth, drought, repair, illness, and ordinary supper they had shared. "I thought I was saving a stranger," she said. "You were. I did not know he would rearrange my entire house. You kept your pans in foolish places. They were practical places. For a person who liked walking twice." She leaned against him. On the far ridge, grandchildren called to one another. The sound traveled cleanly through the air. Miriam looked back toward the ranch. The original cabin remained at its center, expanded by rooms and porches, but still recognizable. Smoke rose from the chimney. Light flashed from the spring channel. Beyond the field stood cabins built for people who had once been told they belonged nowhere. The town had tried to write an ending for her at 41. She had answered with 40 years of evidence. Tomas pressed his cheek to her silver hair. "What do you see?" he asked. "Work that will outlive us. Is that enough?" Miriam watched a hawk circle above the wash. "It is more than enough." They returned home before sunset. That evening, the family gathered beneath the porch where the old iron wheel hung. Samuel read a letter from Millicent. She had completed her training, accepted a teaching post, and declined a proposal from the young man who had finally resumed writing after learning her salary. At the bottom of the letter she had drawn a small blue stone. Miriam touched the empty place at her throat and smiled. Tomas placed the yellow flower, now dried and brittle, inside the family ledger. Then he closed the book. Outside, water moved through the channels in the dark, steady and unseen. The sound reached every house that had grown from the spring. It passed beneath cottonwood roots, beside sleeping cattle, and through fields waiting for another season. Miriam sat with Tomas's hand around hers. She no longer needed the town to understand what had happened. A woman they considered finished had saved a man they considered dangerous. The man had recognized in her not the remains of youth, but the authority of survival. Together they had protected water, built a household, raised a child, changed a town, and made room for others who had been pushed to the edges. Nothing about it had been easy. That was precisely why it had endured.